several people contacted me in various ways and said, no, that ought not to be a falsifying instance for you, and they had various reasons why. Now, I love that kind of discussion. I still think that, at least in my case, from my perspective, the best I can see, it would be a falsifying instance for me. I'm not convinced by the arguments I've heard yet. But here's the crucial point. The discussion, the thinking about it, the grappling with what would, for each one of you, act as a falsifying instance. And why should there be one? Can anyone engage with this? Why, for each one of us, do I say that there ought to be some sort of capacity of your biblical worldview to be falsified? There's at least two reasons. Brian, can you bring Tom the mic? Thank you. We're not on. There we go. Thank you.
Well, from my perspective, for whatever it's worth, the only ultimate truth is God himself. So even the Bible is not God himself. We accept it as his word at this point. But unless it is the Creator himself handing you what he delivers as truth, then everything in the physical realm really is subject to question in my mind.
Okay, yeah, you hit upon, just nailed one of the 2 points I would make, and that is you mentioned the physical realm and that it's all subject to question, because I hope I've made the case adequately that religion and thinking about religion is an empirical thing. It's not like we know. And so in all things empirical, it's interpretive, it's inferential, it's uncertain. And so, yes, our religious viewpoints are based upon empirical knowledge, not a priori knowledge. And so as a result of that, there's definitely going to be the possibility of question. Now, that's one side of the coin. What's the flip side of the coin?
Oh, for me, one is that not everything's true. Some things are false, so you need to be able to realize that some things are going to be true and some aren't. So if you can't recognize that, then I think there's a problem.
Okay, yeah, exactly. You guys are doing great today. Yeah, exactly right. So if, in fact, there's uncertainty, then the flip side of the coin is, exactly as Brian says, not everything is true. And we look around the world, and we see all kinds of worldviews that we personally don't think are true right now, right? Now, we want those people to be intellectually honest, right? We want them to have thought through their view what they really believe and why they believe it, such that, in principle, there would be some way to falsify their view, right? Because if there's no way in principle to falsify their view, then we can never, by any means, reach them to bring them to see the view that we believe, right? So we expect everyone else in the world, because we're the ones that are right? So we expect everyone else in the world to be very intellectually honest and have falsifying instances so that we can connect up with them and show them evidence that ought to falsify their view so we can get them to adopt our paradigm, right? That's the nature of evangelism. If you want to, cut it, dice it, get it down to its fine points, what we're really trying to do with evangelism is show people, here's a paradigm that's different from your paradigm. Here's what's wrong with your paradigm. Our paradigm resolves those problems and has further explanatory power, so you ought to come over to our paradigm. But all of that is based on the idea of showing their paradigm to have problems, falsifying instances. So it would be incredibly arrogant of us to have no way in principle that our view could be falsified when it is a peer of all the other views, right? Okay, so that's my overarching point. If you don't like my Mars example, that's fine. I'm still not convinced. Talk with me. Maybe you can convince me. I'm wide open to being convinced. And I don't say that blithely or trivially or offhandedly. But there better be some falsifying instances. There ought to be ways in principle that your view could be threatened, because it is just another empirical view in the grand marketplace of ideas. So I'm talking about intellectual honesty and a lack of dogmatism and a lack of arrogance about what we believe. Now, to that point, Jesse, could you hit next? I'm going to show you a couple of slides. Wow, it's hard to read that one. But on the website, I'm going to show you just a few slides about the website, because I encourage you to get an account on the site. At that point, you can actually do discussions on the site. Also, I have materials up there. There's supplementary materials to these lectures, and over and above that, there's materials up there that I don't have explicitly linked from the evolution pages. So you'll see that there's a navigation menu up there, and what is it, the third from the bottom of the main menu there is an analysis of evolutionary arguments. That's sort of the main page that branches off to all their articles about this. But not everything on that page is linked directly from there. So for example, if you go to the categories menu, another little one will pop up there, and you'll see things like evolution and religion and so on and so forth. Click the evolution one next, and what you'll get is a list of all of the articles that I have that are in any way categorized as related to evolution. And so you'll notice that there are a couple of there that you're not going to find linked to directly from any of the pages that you would get from that main evolutionary page. They're still categorized as evolutionary articles because they address the issue, but they're not linked directly. So the way to find those, and the way you can find any articles on other subjects, is through that categories menu. And you'll see, for example, that I have a page there called Falsification and Intellectual Honesty. And there I address this very issue about the Mars thing and more details about why I find it to be a falsifying sort of thing. And then the really cool thing is, for any of these articles, next, what you will find is that then it pulls up an article. This is a really important one to read. I'm going to touch on this today, but there's way more detail in this article than I can go into just in a lecture. And at the bottom of every page, next, you'll see that there is a box, leave a reply, and a little CAPTCHA thing, because we don't like bots on our site, so you have to solve a little trivial math question. Pretty simple, like 6 minus 3 is what? So yeah, I don't know. The multiplication ones, those can be a little struggle sometimes, but you know, we have calculators, thank God. So anyway, the bottom line is you'll answer a little math question, and if you log into the site, you'll get this box, and you're able then to leave a comment associated with any particular article. Then these comments both nest and tree, and a full-blown discussion like a forum can emerge there. And so I get notified when a comment is posted. You know, I can monitor who's talking about what. I can hop in if it seems appropriate to me and respond. And so it's just a way for us, you know, Mike, for example, people that are distant, it's a way for you to engage with the material at a level beyond just sitting here passively listening to a lecture. Okay, next. So let's do a brief review of where we currently stand. We've talked about Feynman's infinite point regarding underdeterminism. And can anyone quickly tell me what Feynman was saying when he talks about an infinite number of theories and how that relates to underdeterminism?
I think it was that any number of theories can explain a certain event or
Set of evidence, yeah.
set of events.
Mhm.
So, you know, I guess the idea is that you can't just pick a certain theory and just say that it's.
Yeah, you're all over it, Brian.
Is accurate or should be fully trusted, I guess you could say. So just because it may explain it doesn't mean it's the real answer to what you're seeing.
Right. Okay, good. So basically any given theory is not determined, it's not picked out by the facts, because an infinite number of theories are picked out by the facts. And keep in mind that we care about what's true from a metaphysical point of view, right? So can anyone quickly tell me what metaphysics is about? People have struggled a little bit with this one, so I want to be sure we're moving forward on the same page. Metaphysics is really two words, right? Meta and physics. Well, what's physics about?
It's just the physical world that we see and we observe.
Okay. And so what is the word meta about? Above, bigger, beyond, right? The whole thing. So, remember I was telling you Aristotle had two big volumes. One was the physics, one was the metaphysics. And the physics was about the natural world. The metaphysics was about how do we get a natural world? You know, it's real reality. So physicists obviously think that the natural world, that's what there is. That's all there is. So physics and metaphysics, we're talking the same thing. To do metaphysics is to just do physics. To do physics is to be doing all the metaphysics there is to do. But if we're supernaturalists, we think there's more to the real world than just the physics. So metaphysics then is not constrained to just the natural world, and so we think there's entities, for example, like numbers, propositions, geometrical objects, consciousness that's not explainable in purely physical terms, and so on. And so we think that the real world is more than just the physics. So metaphysics is about what's the furniture of reality. What are the real forces and entities and relations that exist in all of reality? Not just physical reality, but all of reality. So metaphysics opens the door. It's the discussion, if you will, the theories about all of reality. Okay? So, did you have a question? Okay. So we said science is not metaphysics. Science is not doing metaphysics. And I'm going to get into a touch more detail about that today. I want to make that point again and again from different angles. Science thinks it's doing metaphysics, but it's actually not successfully doing metaphysics. In fact, science turns out to be at its worst when it's trying to do metaphysics. And the problem of underdeterminism is the problem, as we're going to get into, because you have to be a scientific realist in order to even be seriously thinking you're doing metaphysics. But underdeterminism really gets underneath the idea of realism in physics. Tom, did you have a...
I'm trying to understand this, so I want to throw out an example that may or may not apply. If physics tries to explain something like consciousness, it automatically is entering a realm which is outside of its definition. Is that a fair statement?
They would deny that, obviously. I mean,
no.
they're going to say that consciousness is reducible to brain states, which is reducible to, matter, ultimately quarks and, other subatomic particles and so forth. So they're going to say, no, mind is discussable in purely physical terms.
I've heard that argument, but there are other examples which I don't have in mind that kind of...
We're by the way, later in this course, going to really gut that view. I mean, I'm with you. I don't think mind is...
Just accepting that, is that a fair example of what you're trying to get at? That there are things like thought and consciousness
Yes.
that are outside of the physical realm.
Right.
That when physicists try to explain it, they're really going outside of what is by definition their area of expertise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so, but what it turns out is That's a classic example of where they're not going to, in principle, be able to give an adequate account of the phenomena. But where things get really interesting is when we're talking tables and chairs and hands and things that, we're very confident really exist. I mean, I have no problem whatsoever saying that hands are a part of the real world, right? But see, physicists are not getting into the issue of whether or not we have hands. They're getting into issues like, well, your hand feels pretty solid to you, but in fact, it's really not. Because really, what your hand consists of is more empty space than actual matter. Oh, well, how can that be? Well, because there's lots of space between the electrons that are orbiting the nuclei of atoms, and even what compose electrons, the quarks and other subatomic particles, there's more space between all of those than the space that occupy the particles. And the space between atoms making up the molecules, there's way more space between the atoms than the space occupied by the actual atoms. And so they're going to tell you all about all kinds of under the appearances elements of reality. We think in terms of the appearances. So we have this appearance, and we go, that I call a hand. And physicists say, well, okay, that's speaking loosely. We're not going to debate it. But in fact, right, and that's where they move into metaphysics. In fact, really, this conglomeration of stuff you call a hand really is nothing like how it appears to you. You seeing the point here? Metaphysics is about getting under the appearances and talking about the irreducible, hardcore realities that compose everything else. Anne? I'm sorry? Makes it a lie.
Yeah, because we know the hand is there. We know there's piece parts in the hand.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them even hurt.
Yes, yes.
But when the physicists then tried to tell you that, it's a matter of atoms and subatoms and et cetera, they're going beyond what a normal person, let's put it that way,
Mm-hmm.
an everyday person would consider as the truth of a hand.
Right. Yes. I wouldn't call it a lie as much as it's a reduction, because, see, what science is fundamentally a reductionistic enterprise. So a biologist or a medical doctor is going to talk about hands in very much like the same terms you and I would talk about them. And so we connect with that explanation of what a hand is. It's not a lie then to say, well, the nervous activities and the sensations that you're getting are really neurochemical reactions. So now you're into chemistry, okay? That's not a lie. It's just a more fine-grained account of what a hand is, right? You're chopping it up into smaller pieces, if you will, and talking about it in more detail.
That's what's wrong with science. They talk way above us, most of us, and and it gets, it's not just not understandable, it just seems to not even be real.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, all academic disciplines do the same thing. I mean, this is one of the aspects of higher education, particularly when you get into graduate education, is you invariably end up breaking up a bigger discipline into smaller and smaller chunks and talking about it in more and more fine-grained terms. So, for example, language. We're talking with each other right now. And you don't need to know anything about subject predicates, I mean consciously, right? You don't need to think in terms of subject predicate. You don't need to think in terms of deep structure. The logic that I introduced you to already was more than most people ever cared to know in their entire lives. And I tell you, believe me, we're scratching the surface, right? So anytime you start getting into more and more detail, two things happen. One, you're able to talk about things more and more accurately, possibly, and you talk about it in a way that begins leaving the layperson completely behind. So the average layperson just doesn't connect with your discourse.
Just let me look at the hand and I'll call it a hand.
Yeah, exactly. Now, where things get troubling, and I think this is what motivates your lie statement, is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking this is where you're going with that. Here's what your intuition is as I start reducing more and more and more, and I start thinking that I'm talking about the thing more and more accurately because I'm being more and more precise, right, and more fine-grained in talking about it, I may be losing something where the hand is more than just the collection of all the little pieces I can talk about at the most fine-grained level, right? There's some, and this goes to consciousness too, Tom. I mean, because the bottom line is, my mind is more than just a stream of conscious events, which is the typical approach that a physicist, a reductionist, neuroscientists think of a mind, is they think a mind is a stream of awareness. But there's more to it than that.
Oh, when you were speaking before, some concepts were coming to my mind. Specifically, how, from a physics standpoint, you explain concepts like honesty or a lie. Even the concept of a lie becomes difficult when you approach it from physics standpoint. But those are, for us who exist and interact, those are real and very important things.
Right. And we would even be realists about ethical facts, right? I mean, we're not going to be anti-realists.
Just the concept of ethics itself.
Yes.
Becomes difficult.
So most scientists tend to be anti-realists about ethics. Back to this realism, anti-realism. Most scientists are anti-realists about ethics. They think that ethics, when you're talking about ethics, what you're talking about is psychology. You're talking about sociology. You're not talking about real human independent features of the universe. You're talking about people. You're talking about how they've come to interact, the psychology and sociology that emerges. Even altruism is given an account in evolutionary terms, right? Altruism emerged because in general, you're going to be self-sacrificing toward those that you're most genetically linked with, which ups the odds that genes much like yours are going to get passed along. And so it's evolutionarily advantageous for you to be altruistic. This is the standard account of altruism. But we're missing something there, right? And that's the problem, is that reductionism, while in general is a good approach and tends toward a more accurate account, you also have to be very, very careful that you're not missing the whole as you're divvying it up into their pieces, that you're not leaving big components behind that actually define the phenomena that you're talking about. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, while you were talking with Ann before, the idea of not seeing the forest for the trees.
Or not seeing, yeah, right, the forest for the trees, yep.
From an evolutionary standpoint, there's the idea of irreducibly
complex.
Yeah, something cannot be reduced beyond a certain simplicity
Right.
before you lose the whole.
Yes, yeah. Or even in the reduction, as you're taking steps further and further down the ladder of simplicity, you haven't skipped entire steps that really are in there, but it turns out that they're not physical. So you're unable to give a physical account of them, so you just skip over them. And just jumping ahead to consciousness, which we're going to talk about in great detail in some weeks.
Can you give an example of what you just said?
Yes, and that's exactly what I was about to do. So take, for example, what are called qualia in consciousness. And you're going, oh no, we're going into yet more terminology. But qualia, from a philosophical point of view, means that subjective me-ness that is associated with all my perceptions. You see, I'm not like a bacteria. I'm not just a little stimuli response machine. I actually have subjective experiences. Anne has pain in her right thumb, okay? Right thumb, the other right. Anne has pain in this thumb. She can tell me all about it in great detail, And I might have even had similar pains myself, so I might even be able to empathize with her pain, but I'm not feeling her pain. I'm not feeling what her pain is for her. And here's a fascinating thing. Her pain for her has that exact same for herness associated with every single one of her experiences. Every bit of consciousness that flows through Anne's mind is consciousness for her because it has this for herness associated with it. And we're going to go into a lot of detail about why that is such a serious problem, because accounting for the for herness of all of her experiences is actually a horrendous, I believe, and many philosophers believe, an utterly in-principle, intractable problem for reductionistic accounts of consciousness. So there's something, I mean, I can talk all about in physical terms and be very comfortable talking about it, that I perceive a color on the basis of neurochemical reactions. So I can reduce color to purely neurochemical reactions. And for lower orders of animals, that's probably all that's going on. But there's something more going on with me than that, because this book is a certain shade of reddish. It's not a pure red. There's a little orange. There's a little brown. Yeah, maroon. There's more going on here than just red. Now, I'm not talking about just the fact that I can pick up subtle shades. That's just yet more stimuli response, neurochemical reactions. But something happens for me that we don't think happens for a lot of the lower order animals who also can perceive this, and that is, I can say, that's a red book for me. I can then back up a step and say, I am sensing that I'm sensing a red book. And I can then back up another step and I can say, I just perceived that I was perceiving a red book. And I can just keep doing that however far back I have the imagination to keep track of the layers, right? The point is, I am self-aware, and all of my awarenesses are really self-awarenesses. I build myself into all my awarenesses. So everything I experience is an experience for me. And Hubert Switzer, in talking about Kant, said Kant explicated this for me factor, as Switzer calls it, better than anybody else. We're going to talk about Kant. We're going to talk about Thomas Nagel. We're going to talk about a number of leading neuroscientists regarding consciousness, and we're going to show how it is that there are pieces, elements that are crucial to the makeup of consciousness that cannot in principle be captured just by talking about neurochemistry. There's something over and above neurochemistry. Somehow, that neurochemistry that gets me the perception of a color, that's not the end of the story, and in fact, that's not even the story, because it's not a perception for me if all we're talking about is neurochemistry. Now again, I can only do the barest nutshell of this at the moment. We're going to spend weeks on this going forward, because we're going to really rigorously demonstrate that mind is an example of a phenomenon that we are absolutely certain exists. I mean, if I'm certain of anything, I'm certain of my own consciousness. It's indubitable for me. There is no falsification of my perspective that I'm conscious. And yet, that is not reducible to purely neurochemical terms. So, while physicists have to be anti-realist about a number of components of what I would call reality, I, in turn, am a realist about those exact same components of reality. But you have to be a realist to be doing metaphysics about certain elements of reality. You have to be saying, these are real existing furniture of reality. They're not something I made up. They don't inhere in me. They really are out there, independent of me. So if we're going to do metaphysics, we're going to be doing realistic metaphysics. Tom, you had another comment?
I touched it, I broke it. Yeah, while you were talking there, the thought came to my mind that old saying, I think, therefore I am.
Mm-hmm.
But you have no way to know if somebody else in the room
That is
thinking,
correct.
From a practical standpoint, yes.
Right.
But if you're going to be honest about it, no, because the only thing you really have is your own perception.
Yep.
That's pretty accurate.
That's exactly right. Yeah. We infer that other people who look and act like we do are doing that because they have a similar self-conscious perception as we do. And they're good inferences. I mean, as we start talking about trotting out the different reasons why we've got good reason to think that, they're actually decent inferences. It's not like you're just off on some wild flyer there, and everyone but me is robots, right? So I just descend into the pit of solipsism, you know? I'm the only conscious thing that there is. I'm alone, you know? No, we don't have to descend into the pit of solipsism because all we're certain of is our own consciousness. But scientists are quick to grant us, because they have it, they're quick to grant that we all have it, and then the question is, what in the world is it that we're talking about? And that ends up being the biggest issue. So one of the key things about philosophy that I found so fascinating early on is so much of the time, different disciplines are answering very rigorously completely the wrong questions. And what philosophy does is back up a step and say, what are even the right questions to be asking? And that, to me, is profoundly fascinating. Because scientists, in this case, when we're talking about mind, scientists are literally barking up completely the wrong tree. They're asking entirely the wrong questions. They're defining the phenomena in completely the wrong way. And so, of course, that's leading them to answer the questions the way they're answering them. But the most fascinating philosophy of mind is that which demonstrates these aren't even the right questions to be asking. So, yeah, good stuff coming up. All right. Observables and in principle unobservables. Hands are direct observables. My own consciousness is a direct observable. This is as close to direct awareness of what we think really exists. Down the road, you know, working down the continuum, we find that there are things that are in principle unobservable. Like, I gave some examples. Anyone remember any of these examples?
I think you had mentioned atoms and things that, well, I guess if you go to the subatomic level, you can't see those things.
Right. Never in principle are going to directly observe them. That's right. So subatomic particles are the classic paradigm example of what we're going to say that's truly physical. It's real. You know, we're going to say, okay, we'll grant you that exists, but it's all inference that gets you there because you can never, in principle, directly observe it. Okay? So then we said, the further we get away from direct observables, the more we're building in inferences, the more we're building in units of measurement, gauges, so we're looking at gauges rather than the thing that's being measured. The further away we get from direct observables, the more and more tenuous science's metaphysical claims become. And that's not just a function of things like subatomic particles. What about claims regarding distant historical events? You can't, in principle, go back in time. You can't, in principle, observe how things were on their model 1 billion years ago. You see what I'm saying? So it's an in principle unobservable. All you can do is take what we now observe and make inferences about it. Right. Exactly. Wonder if it died. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Just back up a little bit. The question comes up, well, did Jesus Christ exist? And I want scientific proof that he did. When you would ask, did Genghis Khan exist? And that same person will say, well, yes. Well, there's no scientific proof that he existed. So the question is not looking at it from a scientific point of view. You would want to be asking, is there historic proof that these persons exist? And to both of those, you would have to say yes. But it's not a scientific approach that you would take in order to prove that. Is that a fair?
Yep. All of that's true. Although I always, when somebody hits me up with that kind of a thing, either personally or in an online form or that kind of thing, I always make a point of saying there is no such thing as historical proof. There's no such thing as scientific proof. Proof, remember? Proof. All are empirical endeavors, and it is impossible to prove anything empirically. Do you remember why? And this is part of what we devoted weeks of logic to, and this is something that it is critical to call people on because they speak really loosely on this point, and they do so in a way that is extremely self-serving to their perspective. So it's something to gut right from the beginning, split it open, pull the guts out of it, and let them know you don't even get started with that kind of an approach because what you're asking for is impossible in principle.
Because empirical evidence is too personal.
Empirical evidence is always going to be inductive, and induction can never provide a proof. Right? Induction always makes the conclusion at best likely, but it can never prove conclusions. Only the deductive method can prove a conclusion, but empirical inferences are always inductive inferences. Is the sun going to rise tomorrow? How many of you have any doubt that the sun is going to arise tomorrow? I don't see any hands. Can you prove that the sun will rise tomorrow? No. Not until tomorrow, but by then, you're not proving the statement of the conclusion, right? Then you're just looking backward and saying, I see the sun rose. But now how confident, how certain can you be of even that? Do you know, can you prove that you have hands?
Outside of myself, no. Outside of my own ability to observe, no.
But is even that enough?
No.
Right, I mean, we got into this.
Yeah.
You lop this hand off, you may still have some sensations of having a hand. Phantom limb syndrome, does that mean you have a hand? Why does one sense get to trump another? All empirical evidence is suspect. All. Without exception. There is no certain empirical evidence. Then the inferences that are derived from empirical evidences are themselves at best probabilistic inferences. They can never be certain inferences. And so there is no such thing in principle as science has proved, or scientific proofs, or studies have shown, or any of those kinds of loose, fluffy talk that makes it seem like things are a lot more certain than they are. And that's the point with observables and direct, in principle, unobservables, is if you can't even be certain, if you can't even prove that you have hands, which is as close to a direct observable as there is, what are you talking about historical proofs with distant historical events and personalities? What are you talking about quarks and Higgs bosons and so on and so forth? Talk all you want. I have no problem with your models, but at least have the decency to not be building in certainty talk that you're not entitled to. Okay? So I'm saying be very, very careful and hold people to account when they start talking about scientific proofs. Because what they'll always end up doing is, okay, you're going to be all nitpicky about it, okay. Yeah, okay, they'll admit, yep, science can't prove anything, but I'm pretty confident, it's good enough for me, I'm pretty confident I have hands, and I'm pretty confident there's quarks. And then I'll say, wait. Now that we know that we're no longer in the realm of certainty, which is an either or, right? An argument is either deductively proved or it's not, right? The conclusion is either valid and the argument is sound, or it's not. These are either or. There's no continuum there. There's no range of probabilisticness. But that's not the case when we get into things like unobservables in principle. Now, you're way down at the other end away from certainty, because there's certainty, either or. Then there's this whole realm of direct observables of which we're pretty confident. Then you start getting into things that take more inferences, like I observed an accident along with 4 other people. Their accounts of the accident differ from mine. I'm pretty confident I saw what I saw, but happened really quick. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I even completely confused in my mind. We tend to see what we're looking for. I'm not positive of what I saw in the accident. I'm pretty confident. Then we get into, you see what I'm saying? The further and further down the road from direct observables you get, the more and more inferences and the less and less probable your conclusions are becoming.
Yeah, then it becomes percentages of probability.
Exactly.
I think I sidetracked you in a way I didn't intend to, where I was going with the historic as opposed to scientific proof, the idea of asking the wrong question, which was...
But both are completely valid, and I went into a little more detail on this than I intended to, but I actually build extra time into a series like this, so if we get sidetracked and don't cover everything in one lecture, I'll build it into another, and we'll get it done. So it's not a problem at all, Tom. And you're exactly right in what you're saying, that history can't be a proof. Science can't be a proof.
No,
So-
but the questions
Right.
are appropriate depending on what you're talking about. One, whether
Be
you're
in the
looking
right
for
field,
scientific-
that's right,
If
that's
you're
one
looking for
thing.
scientific proof as opposed to historic evidence.
Right. Definitely a crucial point. But call them on the bit about proving. Get them on that continuum of probability and make them own it. It is actually a really important point, because since the Enlightenment, science has come to be viewed as the most certain way to do metaphysics that we have. By and large, most people buy science. And what we need to do is to start holding them accountable and say, if you're going to bag on religion, I've said repeatedly, and I'll say again, the indictments against the way religious people think are often justified. But the principled approaches that they take to bagging on religion, as you just noted, Tom, saying, well, Christ, how do we have any proof he existed? Well, okay, they're talking out of both sides of their mouths, and we need to be very systematic about calling them on those kinds of things. So, yeah, very good. Next. All right, so metaphysics, I said, it implies realism about the subject discourse. And remember I said discourse. There's different discourses, right? I'm not a realist about humor. No one laughed at that. The way I delivered that, oh, now you're laughing. Oh, okay. So now I try to make a serious statement, and now people, wait. You see, humor is in us. We define it. We produce the funniness, right? There's no, facts of the universe apart from us. This joke just is funny, whether anyone laughs at it or not. Ridiculous, okay? There's no realism about humor. Beauty. Well, now, if you're a Christian, you might argue that you can be a realist about beauty, right? You could say, well, God defines the good and the beautiful and so forth. So, right, there is this objective, extra-human fact of the matter in the universe about beauty. But that may be taking it a bit too far, because we'll never have a direct perception of God. We're all kind of feeling the elephant, right? But you notice how different discourses could be realistic or anti-realistic. You don't have to be just a broad spectrum realist. You can be a realist in one discourse and an anti-realist in another. Ethics. Remember I said, naturalists have to be anti-realist about ethics. They have to be subjectivists about ethics. They have to think that ethics is a human-generated, emergent property of human psychology and human sociology, and so there is no ethics, there are no ethical facts out there apart from humans. We generate ethics. And so they're anti-realists about ethics. Christians, on the other hand, tend to be very realistic about ethics, right? We discover ethics in the same way we discover the Pythagorean theorem. It's a fact of the universe. There are ethical facts, and we get in touch with them. We don't make them. They're not a function of us. We discover them. And as I'm using these examples, I'm hoping that you're seeing how a discourse is realistic and how a discourse is anti-realistic by the kinds of questions and things that I'm saying. So if I can ask the question, how do we in some way produce it, then we're talking anti-realism. If you're talking, by what means would we discover it, then we're talking realism. It's out there. I try to get in touch with it. I don't have to try to get in touch with it if it's me. If I'm producing it, see, you can ask the question, why did you find that funny? And you can start talking in terms of, I found it funny because I can relate to that guy, and I've been in a situation similar to that, and right? But think about the nature of the account you're giving. The account you're giving is all about you. If somebody asks you, why do you believe in the Pythagorean theorem? What's not an appropriate answer is, well, I used to know a Pythagorean right triangle one time, and yeah, I can relate to it. Matter of fact, I've known several in my time, and they all shared the property of having the Pythagorean theorem true of them. And so I don't know, it just seems to me like it's a true theorem because, I mean, every right triangle I've ever known had it. I mean, it applied. That's what we don't do, right? Because you never are in touch with right triangles that the Pythagorean theorem applies to. Are you seeing my point? If it's in me and I produce it, or we collectively, intersubjectively produce it, then it's an anti-realistic discourse. If it's totally outside of and beyond humans and not logically dependent upon humans, then you're talking realism. So to do metaphysics implies realism. We're not just talking about how we perceive things, we're talking about how things really are completely apart from us. We're trying to get underneath the appearances, which is exactly our example about the hand. A physicist is saying, I grant you, you have a hand. Now let's talk about it. And you want to say, Anne certainly wants to say, what's there to talk about? I have a hand. That's all I need to know. And the physicist says, that's fine, you're a lay person, you just keep believing in that. In fact, what you're staring at, that's not the way it really is. Well, what are they doing now? Realism about hands. What they're saying is, this hand is in a sense not really part of the furniture of the universe. It's just a way you happen to conglomerate the real furniture of the universe into a blob that you label a hand. But that blob, as you happen to put it together, isn't really what's there, because what's really there are quarks. Yeah. We didn't put it together. It's true. That doesn't mean that you're realistic about it. To you, it's there. That's subjective. Well, in a sense, you do. This is a little abstract. I should have brought some pictures. Matter of fact, I think I have some on that fob, but it'd be a pain to get to them. Have you seen these pictures where you can perceive it one way? Like, you know, you see two faces, for example. Another person sees a candlestick, those kinds of pictures. Some people are like unable to see the candlestick. All they see are the two faces, and they can't shift in their thinking to see the candlestick. Other people can only see the candlestick, and they don't get the two faces bit. And there are some really complicated ones where maybe there's 3 or even more images, you know, built into the picture. Or you've seen these pictures where it's just a bunch of weird squiggly lines, but if you peer past it and into it, a 3-dimensional image emerges and you pick it up. Some people are incapable of doing that. Other people can do it almost instantly. Well, what's really there? Okay? The point is your brain, your mind puts things together. I believe it was actually Popper that in his lectures to early students, like incoming students, he would have them sit in a room and he would say, now what I want you to do is to just observe. Okay? And we're just going to observe for about 5 minutes, and then I want you to write down what you observed. Now, I don't want you doing any interpretation at all. You do not get to do inferences. You do not get to do interpretation. Just observe. Purely observe for 5 minutes. If we had a little more time, we'd do this exercise. It's kind of fun. And then you write down what you observe. And guess what you're going to find? You're going to start saying things like, I observed a wall. I observed it was beige. I observed that I was observing the wall because I happened to be thinking about it just then. So I guess I observed myself observing the wall. I observed the time, right? And you're going to write down what you observed in 5 minutes. And guess what? Every single thing you observe without exception is a function of inferences and interpretation, and you didn't directly observe one single thing at all. And there's actually a reason for it, and Kant beautifully explained it. Difficult to understand, but he did the most slam dunk job ever done in explaining why that's the case. And it's because we categorize, we synthesize. We get all this raw data flooding in on us, and we synthesize it into subject-predicate terms. So we talk about, I observed a beige wall. What am I doing? I'm doing predication. I'm assigning an object a subject term, and then I'm predicating of it a predicate term, and I'm already doing inferences, and I'm already building language into the thing. And the wall is not for me some abstraction. It is for me literally inferences and interpretations that I've put together and assembled. And Kant says that assembly occurs even below the level of consciousness itself. That assembly produces consciousness. Your consciousness is always of things, but you're doing synthesis to ever get to the point of being aware of things. So the point is, in a very real sense, you do produce that hand, i.e. you produce the perception of it, which is all it is for you.
Well, the way you were describing it, I'm coming to the theory that the whole thing is perception.
Yes.
It depends
Of the
on
empirical world.
of who is perceiving what, like your picture. I've seen many of those. And sometimes I can determine, sometimes I've not been able to. But the point is, it was my perception. Because somebody else could see the difference in one picture that I couldn't.
Yes. And so if somebody were to say to you, what is this picture? You would say, it's two faces. And somebody else might say, it is not.
Right. They'd say, okay, it's a candle.
Exactly. And the point is, it's the exact same process that's taking place when you perceive your hand. There's nothing different in principle about the synthesizing, assembling, interpreting process that's going on that produces for you what your perceptions are. Okay? And this is a fundamental principle of all empiricism. Okay? And so what it means is we really do contribute to our perceptions. And that's what I meant. And this is a very, very good point to make, because this is all forward-looking. But yeah, in a very real sense, they are perceptions for us. And so to get beneath that is what physicists think they're doing. They're saying, forget the appearances. That's just all stuff. But the irony to it is, they're doing the exact same thing, just down at that end of the spectrum. Are you seeing my point? You do it here, they do it at the level of subatomic particles. It's the exact same perceiving, interpreting, inferring process, and it's what makes empirical knowledge uncertain in principle, top to bottom.
Isn't it then dependent upon our paradigm, because their set of and their way of thinking is different from ours? We're looking at both the same evidence, but their conclusion is different than our conclusion.
Excellent, excellent. So let's move on. That's a perfect segue to move on. Tom?
Since everything is dependent on our perception, if you were to take somebody and deny them all sensory perception, if you took away their ability to sense anything,
Yeah,
with
sensory
any of their
deprivation
senses,
tanks.
what then becomes real?
Well, it's actually really classic. There have been experiments done on this very thing. Kant, for example, said his proof, I'm going to just, such an irresponsible job. I'm going to nutshell for you very quickly Kant's proof that there are external objects, that there is an external world, that what Kant calls it is the refutation of idealism. Reality is not just a bunch of ideas. There are actual, real, external things that exist. And the reason is because we can't keep track of even the passage of time without ordering it in terms of events that are external to us. Okay? We all know I had this thought before that thought, right? So the idea, Kant says, is there has to be a substratum in which we are immersed, and changes in that substratum that we perceive are what make time have an order for us. And if you think about this for a minute, you'll realize it's true. Time itself, Kant argues, is in us. Time is not a function of metaphysical reality. Time's in us. It's something about the way we process reality. But the ordering of events in time presumes an external world. And it's actually been demonstrated. You put people in sensory deprivation tanks where they start trying to hum to themselves. Very quickly, you start feeling like you're going insane. And it's because the way we order events in our own minds depends upon our sensory connection with events in an external world. So you deprive people of those events in the external world, and you very quickly start losing track of even when you thought what. You can't just internally say, I'm thinking 1, I'm thinking 2, I'm thinking 3, dang, I'm going to keep this in order, I'm thinking 5. Wait a minute, did I think 2 already? I remember I thought 2. Did I think it before? When did I? You very quickly just start fritzing out, because everything you think and how you process is so dependent upon your awareness of the passage of time, but all of that presumes that you're immersed in an external world that you happen to be sensorially in touch with. Deprive you of that, and consciousness itself begins to just blow away like leaves in the wind. It's fascinating. The sensory deprivation experiments are truly fascinating. And if anything, they indicate, just as empirical experiments, they indicate what Kant, I believe, deductively proved is true, and that is, we're embodied for a reason. God gave us consciousness, but our consciousness is fed by the input we get sensorially. And so we are necessarily embodied. We can't even imagine what reality would be like not embodied, not immersed in sensory input, not in space, not in time. It's beyond our ken to even imagine, okay? But Kant was brilliant at doing true metaphysics, getting underneath even the quarks and the Higgs bosons and all that stuff. Kant got under how that is anything for us. And that's what genuine metaphysics is. Getting to the core of what there really, really is, and how everything else, all the appearances, emerge from that. And that's the point about hands, and your hand emerges for you as a result of, on the physical account, the interaction of subatomic particles that then in turn build up this physical thing you perceive, which then in turn generates neurochemical stimuli into your brain, and they're pretty much done, right? And they've told you now how this appears to you to be a hand, and that's their account, and they're done with it. Kant, Thomas Nagel, and others will say, you're not even close to done. You haven't even asked the right questions yet, because that's not the hard part. The hard part isn't the subatomic particles and neurochemical reactions. The hard part is qualia. And you have nothing to say about that. Okay, so that's where we're going. And that's why I'm saying there are aspects of reality that nobody debates are real, and yet the purely physicalist, naturalistic account of those phenomena, those accounts are utterly inadequate. Okay, so I do want to move on to paradigms. So I wanted to talk briefly about Kuhn. We're not even going to get into evolution yet, although that was later in this PowerPoint. Okay, next. Kuhn's underdeterminism. Okay, Thomas Kuhn wrote a book. I told you guys about that book. Does anyone remember what it was called? Good, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn wrote this book in 1962, and it was a bombshell. And philosophy of science has more or less revolved around Kuhn's conclusions in that book. So I highly recommend, if there's any book you get The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Our very use of the term paradigm and paradigm shift emerges from this book. So it's had a sweeping, just popular effect on common culture, because now we just every day talk in terms of paradigm shifts. Well, what's a paradigm? What's a paradigm shift? And how does it relate to underdeterminism? Kuhn was a hardcore anti-realist about the scientific enterprise in general. Kuhn believed that science was in principle an anti-realistic enterprise, and the book is designed to explain why. So Kuhn famously has a passage, I quote it on the website, it's frequently summarized very accurately by saying, science progresses, but not toward anything, okay? Science is constantly making progress, but not toward the truth, okay? So next. Normal science always operates within prevailing paradigms. The process of scientific research that you see going on every day, that process is what Kuhn would call normal science. And that always, without exception, happens in the context of a prevailing paradigm, a bigger picture that constrains what the nature of scientific theories are going to look like and are going to work like within that structure. Next. Evidence of the success of a prevailing paradigm are everywhere to be found. And this is exactly what Popper says, right? I mean, everywhere you look are verifications of your view. Whatever your view happens to be, you will find verifications of it everywhere you look. Verification is not the hard part. Falsification is the hard part. Falsification is where the intellectual honesty rubber meets the road. Okay? Next. Anomalies are few and far between. Well, what's an anomaly? Again, I'm whipping here, so I really encourage you to read this article on the website in which I summarize Kuhn for you. I'm not going to make you read a multi-100-page book just to get these points, but I do encourage you to do that because there's a lot of great information and detail there. Bottom line is, an anomaly is evidence that could be construed as a falsifying instance. In the paradigm, my theory predicts such and such to occur. It doesn't occur. Something else occurs. That doesn't fit. It's evidence that the world hits the paradigm with that doesn't seem to neatly integrate. But because everywhere I look, I see verifications of my view, I not only am not looking where the anomalies exist, but when they happen to hit me upside the head, they're few and far between, and what am I going to do with those? I'm going to work hard to integrate them into the paradigm. This is human psychology. This goes all the way back to Clifford. What did Clifford have to say about knowledge? We love to know things. It gives us a sense of power. It gives us a sense of control. It gives us a sense of the ability that we can make the world the way we want it to be, because we know how things are, we know how they work, we know the relations, and so it gives us the ability to do things and manipulate things and change things. If I'm wandering around and I'm clueless, right, I don't have any power in the world. Knowledge is power, and human beings love power. We've loved it from the Garden of Eden, right? Human beings love power. We love to know. Why is it called the tree of the knowledge of the thing God didn't want us to know? We want to know. It is core to our psychology. It's so core, it's the rose-colored glasses we can't take off. And so, Kuhn denotes down through the history of science how this thirst for knowledge and this thirst for power that emerges from knowledge has the psychological and sociological effect that everywhere we look, we see verifications of our paradigm, because we know then. And when we get hit with an anomaly, man, we devote amazing research time, money, and effort to resolving the anomaly. Next. Normal science, then, is about extending the paradigm and integrating, doing anomaly solving. That is what scientific research is about. That's what scientific research does. Next. So, paradigms prevail. I mean, what's a prevailing paradigm? Well, it's a view that a large enough body of scientists have that it is the working model under which research gets done. And it prevails for two primary reasons, Kuhn says. One is that it's not yet in crisis, and it appears to be better than any of the alternatives. So it's the prevailing paradigm. Next. Obviously, you're already seeing there's tremendous resistance to paradigm shifts. And so Kuhn, what's a scientific revolution? For Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions, the name of the book, is describing what mechanisms go into play to get science to shift from one paradigm to another. And throughout the entire history of science, what Kuhn describes is exactly what we observe. Next. Paradigm shifts never, ever occur as a function of the rats fleeing a sinking ship. Never. It's just not the case that scientists go, well, this paradigm's just broken, I'm done with it. Why? Well, because then there's no more scientific research to be done, because all scientific research is done in the context of a paradigm. And so, science comes to a stop, literally a stop, in the absence of a paradigm. So there is no such thing as the rat saying, this is a broken paradigm, a sinking ship, I'm done with it. Because you're done with it to do what? Next. The rats always flee a sinking ship for another ship. You're always going to have a paradigm shift, never the abandoning of a paradigm all by itself. You always are going to have to see an alternative paradigm to jump to before you're going to jump from this one. Next. And again. So why are paradigm shifts not more common? Why was Newton the guy for hundreds of years, despite the fact that we knew from the beginning that the orbit of Mercury was a problem. It was an anomaly. It was threatening to the paradigm. Newtonian physics works. It's successful. Now notice here we're making a disconnect, and I'm making this again and again and again. There's a disconnect between what works and what's true. Okay? Scientists tend to conflate these. People who are scientifically minded conflate these. They will say things like, well, you show me any other discipline that has produced all the miraculous, amazing things that science has produced. To which I will say, there is none. Science is amazing. Absolutely, it's the best, it's the only game in town for giving us microwave ovens, probes that land on speeding comets, and space shuttles that don't blow up most of the time. It's the only game in town. It's awesome. As an engineering project. As a truth-seeking mechanism, it's atrocious. Again and again and again, the prevailing paradigm is demonstrated to be false. Metaphysically, we still use Newton to land probes on speeding comets. He's good enough for that. But his metaphysics are false. Okay, that is the critical point. Next. But what is that? When everywhere we look, we see verifications of our paradigm. When we say the paradigm must be true because it works, it's successful, it's a version of verificationism, right? We're saying it's producing these results, therefore it's good, it's successful. And isn't that just as good as true? I mean, isn't that all we care about? I mean, I've literally had conversations with physicists on some of these forums in which I press them to this point, and they will finally capitulate and say, okay, it's pure pragmatism. I don't care. Pragmatism is as good enough as truth for me. To which I say, fine, but then you don't get to make metaphysical claims like, I've proved God doesn't exist, as Stephen Hawking does. You see what I'm saying? You don't get to do metaphysics. Once you grant that you're anti-realist and you're doing pragmatics, you don't get to start claiming that you're doing metaphysics. You absolve yourself at that point of the claim you're doing metaphysics. You recuse yourself from the metaphysical discourse. And that is what is the critical point. I'll make it again and again. We'll turn it all different facets. The point is science is not doing metaphysics. Okay. That's verificationism. What most scientists are doing within their paradigm is a species of verificationism. Next. But paradigms are always broken. I said there's two types of concrete, slab concrete. Concrete that has cracked and concrete that's going to crack. There are two types of paradigms. Paradigms that have failed and have been abandoned for another, and those that are going to fail and be abandoned for another. Two types of paradigms. All paradigms have anomalies. Why? Because they're not true. Plain and simple. They're not true. Therefore, there's going to be falsifying evidences start piling up because they're not true. Next. So scientists begin to start considering alternatives. While they're doing this, they are still within the existing paradigm. Their research is initially trying to resolve the anomaly, but in the process of doing this, they begin to discover there might be another way of thinking about this, entirely a different way of thinking about this. Einstein, who thinks, we got problems with Newton, but what if things like centrifugal force was indistinguishable from gravity? So Einstein starts dreaming up these little thought experiments where he imagines things like you're standing in an elevator, and imagine the force of gravity that you feel as that elevator accelerates. It feels to you like gravity. Well, imagine you were in a centrifuge, and out at the end of the centrifuge, it would feel like gravity to you. But you could be in a gravity-free environment. It feels like gravity to you. is there any difference in principle between the forces of motion and the forces of gravity? And as soon as Einstein opened his mind to think outside the box, outside the Newtonian paradigm at all, the Newtonian paradigm very quickly just all unraveled. Next. Notice it has to be sold to the community. Einstein was not just accepted. Next. Okay. When anomaly pressure is sufficient and an alternative is available, finally the rats will jump the ship. And so as Einstein's paradigm became more and more verified experimentally, it started looking like a true paradigm. He also explained what was wrong with Newton's. So he had both a positive account and what we call an error theory. Here's why we're seeing the anomalies in Newton's theory. Here's why it's wrong. Here's why it can't be salvaged. Here's why it's broken to the core. And then scientists said, because they think they're doing metaphysics, science said, Einstein, you're right. Your view of reality is closer to the truth. Your paradigm is a more accurate description of the way things seem to be to us than Newton's was. Therefore, it's a refinement of Newton. Therefore, we like it. Therefore, we're going to jump ship to it. But notice this is all a bunch of psychologically working it around. Okay? Next. So why are there not dozens and dozens, right? There's an infinite number of possible theories. So why are there not dozens and dozens of different paradigms out there? Why are scientists not more ongoingly aware of this infinite problem, as Feynman calls it? Did you have a comment, Tom? Okay. Well, there's all kinds of reasons, and you'll find that none of them have to do with truth. There are things like there's limited research time and budgets. Things like there's psychological pressures. This is huge. I mean, Kuhn has most of a chapter devoted to just the training that gets done in science. And it's fascinating because think about the science education you had growing up. Think about your high school science education. A textbook is plopped in front of you. You're told to start reading through the pages. Lectures are given. Tests are given. What are they doing? They're telling you about reality in the paradigm, right? Here's what they don't do. They don't say, this is a good textbook and describes paradigm A really well. You need to read this. This here is also a really good textbook. It describes paradigm B really well. You need to read and understand this. Over here is another textbook. It describes paradigm C. By the way, there's an infinite number of these guys, so it's going to be a long term. That's what they don't do. Okay? You get trained in a paradigm. If anything, that conformity pressure gets stronger and stronger as you get higher and higher in your educational process within the paradigm. The pressure to conform is immense. You don't write a PhD dissertation in physics by saying, Einstein was an idiot, right? That's what you don't do. You're going to conform. You're going to get, but then postdoc fellowships. You're not going to get to some physics department and start doing a postdoc fellowship by starting out saying, I'm going to devote your money and my time, as well as training my grad students, about how nutty Einstein was and how dismal the prospects are that that paradigm is actually the right one. It goes nowhere. So all the way up the ladder, you're trained by being fitted into a paradigm. And the pressure to conform is absolutely immense. So there are very few scientists that have the personality and the imagination to, after all of that process, even begin to start thinking outside that box. But a few do, which is how alternate paradigms emerge in the first place. Most scientists don't think in terms of underdetermination. Imagine you're a scientist and you've devoted your entire life to a research project. Why are you doing that? Just psychologically, as a human being. What's motivating you to do that? You think you're discovering the truth. You don't think that all you're doing and now let's be really blunt. Scientists that may watch this are not going to like this, then demonstrate that I'm wrong. Here's what you don't want to think as a scientist, but yet here is reality. All of my research is going toward resolving an anomaly or expanding the reach of my existing paradigm, even though I know that there's literally an infinite number of other possible accounts of this evidence that I'm unearthing here. I'm going to just arbitrarily stick with mine because it's as good as any other of the infinite set. It'll enable us to build a better microwave oven. That'll be a good thing. True? Nah, not in principle. What I'm doing has nothing to do with the truth. And I don't care, because if I can just expand the paradigm enough to get us a better microwave oven, it's been a life well lived. Yay! That is not what scientists are doing. That's not what motivates human beings. You delude yourself into thinking you're getting us closer to the truth. You delude yourself into thinking in Cliffordian terms that you're expanding the reach of our knowledge. You think you're doing truth-seeking. You firmly believe it. And you take deep, primal offense at some stupid non-scientist philosopher, or worse, a historian of science, coming to the conclusion that you're not doing truth-seeking. That's outrageous, it's outlandish, and you take deep offense at it. Sorry, but that's the fact of the matter. So, they don't think that's what they're doing. They don't psychologically buy into how bad of a problem underdeterminism is, and they think they're doing truth-seeking. Next. So they think physics is really doing metaphysics, but when pressed, as I've already described, Ann, do you want to switch sides here? We're just about done here. When pressed, they will admit that they really think that pragmatism is just equivalent to truth. But that's a problem, because you can't have it both ways. You see, if they're really doing metaphysics, that implies realism. It implies that they're engaged in a realistic, truth-seeking exercise. But that says then you're doing some kind of verificationism, and pragmatism is not an adequate account of what we mean by truth-seeking. So you can't both be willing to retreat to, well, pragmatism is as good as truth, and claim that you're doing metaphysics. You can't, in principle, have them both. Next. Okay, so we're not going to get into evolutionary theory, which is where I was headed today, but I have a bunch of information online. I hope you'll look at it that'll actually help you get set up for the next time. And then it'll be 2 weeks, because I'm going to be out of town for the next 2 weeks. But then in January, we'll pick this up again. Good segue, I guess, because it's a good point to just go into a whole new thing with all this backdrop we've got. And we're going to start talking about exactly how evolutionary theory actually works, what it really is. Because most people actually are quite confused or have some misperceptions about what evolutionary theory really is and what it's really saying, and the mechanisms that are purported to work within it. So we're going to get into a lot of detail about that, and obviously in this context. Yeah?
How do you know when there's sufficient anomalies to tip to a new paradigm?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what Kuhn says is, there's no clear, bright line. So what ends up happening is the new paradigm begins to get more and more popularity. It begins to become more and more acceptable to do research over here. As a grad student, you're no longer nutty and won't get a dissertation approved if your dissertation is within this paradigm. And so it begins to rise in prominence as a legitimate alternative. Meanwhile, now instead of seeing verifications everywhere you look over here, more and more, psychologically, you're seeing falsifications everywhere you look over here. You're seeing a lot fewer falsifications here, a lot more falsifications here. This one starts being verifyingly raised, this one starts being falsifyingly put down, and it's just a psychological shift that occurs.
I would think it's not, strictly speaking, the number, but the seriousness of the anomaly play into it too.
Right, absolutely. I mean, even when we talk about my falsification regarding, say, life on Mars, one person that responded said, look, something like that would not be sufficient for me to just give up my Christianity and quit believing in God. And my response, I haven't been able to respond yet, but my response would be, that's not what I'm saying either, right? I'm not saying I'm going to suddenly disbelieve in God because there's life on Mars. I'm going to have to totally rethink my paradigm. I might have to shift paradigms. Maybe instead of being a literal Genesis reading young earth creationist, I find that instead I'm forced to be a theistic evolutionist and an old earth, not even necessarily creationist, just that God's in there somewhere. Because look, I still have huge problems with a purely naturalistic account. I don't believe, or let me say it in a positive form, I believe Kant slam dunk proved that science will not, in principle, ever be able to give an adequate account of consciousness. That enough tells me science is not all there is regarding an account of consciousness. There's something beyond naturalism. There's something beyond materialism. I don't buy the biconditional relation between physics and metaphysics. I don't buy it. I have too much philosophical background. I've read too much. I've seen too many what I would call deductive proofs that that biconditional is broken. That alone tells me there's something supernatural out there. Does that mean I'm suddenly, a Judeo-Christian theist? Maybe not. Maybe that would be threatened. But I don't throw all the baby out with the bathwater. Do you see what I'm saying? The point is just falsifications have greater or lesser weight, as you say. It's not just a function of number, although you can die the death of 1,000 pinpricks. So, yeah, I'm babbling now. That's the point. Whatever I was babbling about is the point.
Another question, and is there a reason, would one of the reasons for scientists to remain in their paradigm view of things be because of that issue of power and loftiness on their pedestal, and so therefore calling into question or shifting paradigm calls into question everything that they've always and have done and spent most of their life in research doing?
Oh, yeah.
You would call into question that, and it does it in a sense call in the credibility of them as a scientist to begin with by shifting.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Philip Johnson really poignantly makes this point in his really seminal book, Darwin on Trial. And the way he words it, I'll have to paraphrase this at the moment because I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but there's a passage in there in which he talks about that science is the new religion, and physicists, if anybody, are the new priests of the religion. And you look at any society, and who are the real power players? I mean, they're above pharaohs, they're above emperors, right? I mean, who has the influence in a religion-based society? The priests. And look at the power the Catholic Church wielded over millennia, because they trump emperors, nations, right? They trump it all, because there's nothing more important to people than being righteous by whatever account you want to give of righteousness, okay? Well, today, righteousness consists in bowing down to the physicists, okay? Because they are the truth seekers. Yeah, well, they're not about to just give that up on a whim. I mean, even the courts support them in that view at this point. So, as a society, we've totally bought that pedestal. And that's why I'm saying it's a huge mistake for creation scientists to try to clamber their way up onto that pedestal. That's a complete, and I'm going to get into it when I start talking about evolutionary theory and paradigms and so on and so forth. It's an utterly futile attempt. You will not succeed. I'm telling creation scientists right now, you will not succeed with that strategy. You cannot get onto the pedestal with science because you're doing a totally different thing. What you can do is to demonstrate, start knocking the blocks out of the pedestal and demonstrate science is doing empiricism, religion is doing empiricism, we're in the exact same epistemic hole, you're in no epistemically privileged position, there's no pedestal for you to be on. Tom.
You just said what I was going to say. There's
Okay.
no way. In essence, what I was going to say along the same lines, there is no way to prove the existence of God.
No. And when you get to these ultimate questions, it's always things like, all right, well, you want to claim God's the ultimate creator. Who created God? Well, that is the exact same propositional content as the question, all right, you want to talk about percolating quantum events that produce universes? Well, what was the substratum of the quantum percolation? It's the exact same propositional content. We're asking questions that have, in principle, no answer. These are utterly futile questions to be asking. What you need to be asking instead is a bit removed from these ultimate questions and ask questions like, empirically speaking, what sorts of thumbprints do we see in the world, the natural world?
I don't want to sidetrack, but to cut to the chase in a practical, social way that benefits Christianity, to me, what we need is a reverse scopes trial, where we put science on trial and say, prove it. And if we can come at it that way, that in a pragmatic, social way, does exactly what you're doing in a philosophical way, which is reduce the priesthood of science to a level that's no different than the priesthood of a Christian denomination.
Right. Just tell them, be really honest with the court about all it is you don't know.
And what I see is a resistance to that, where empirical evidence is readily available, even to laypersons, that the science that is taught in the classroom has serious flaws, and I'm being really polite in saying it that way.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas if somebody with any kind of knowledge of that would be to take that to a courtroom, it would be easy to knock that pedestal out from under.
Right.
And it's
right.
just not being done, and I, quite frankly, don't understand that.
Well, if the court did nothing more than read that little, quite small philosophy of science book edited by Robert Klee that I encourage you folks to get and read. I think it's about a $15 book, and it does all facets: realism, anti-realism, underdeterminism, you name it. It's a beautiful anthology about all the things we're talking about. Just get a court to read that book through cover to cover and then say, really? Science really is entitled to this pedestal, huh? Because I'm not even saying that all of it is demonstrably true, right? I mean, maybe Bos von Frossen is just wrong about his discussion of scientific anti-realism. Maybe there's a way of interpreting the evidence in a totally different way than Kuhn does, and so you don't get anti-realism out of it. But we're not talking about proofs. We're talking about the weight of evidence. We're talking about what's most plausible. And so this is a really good point to sort of sum this up by saying, scientists say Judeo-Christian religion is implausible in the face of the evidence. I turn around and say, your current view of metaphysics is implausible in the face of the evidence. It's about plausibility. It's about, can you, in all, as close to objectively speaking as I say, can you be intellectually honest? And I point the finger at us as much as I do at scientists, because most Christians, and I say most, and I say it provocatively and very intentionally provocatively, most Christians are nothing even resembling intellectually honest. They're in a paradigm, they like their paradigm, no question is going to shake them out of that paradigm. They cannot, in principle, dream up what could be falsifying instances for their paradigm. There's no evidential looking, they don't doubt, they don't question, they are saved, they know it, nothing's good, right? I mean, I stand on the firm rock of Jesus Christ and I am saved, yay! And I mean, it's ridiculous. It's intellectually indefensible. And the scientific community and most growing body of the world, even those who say, I don't think, I mean, it's over 70% of people in this country think that evolution is not an adequate account of origins. Yet those same people will say, but these right-wing religious people make me puke. We have changed the gospel into trying to legislate against abortion. And that's what we think we're doing good in the world, right? We are intellectually indefensible as a body of believers. And that has to change. So if we're going to knock science off its pedestal, we got to be knocking our own dogmatism, our own certainty, our own intolerance off the pedestal as well. I'm probably going to get a bunch of heat for this one, but man, I'm going for it. I personally don't care from a legal point of view whether gay marriage is legal or not. I don't care. It's not my job as a Christian in the world to enforce a certain standard of morality. That's not what I'm to do in the world. That's not my job. Tom.
Can I back you up on that?
Yeah.
I wrestled with what you're talking about for a long time, and what I realized is, at its heart, Christianity cannot be coercive, or it does not work.
Coercion is antithetical to every principle of Christianity. You cannot legislate morality.
But you can convict people to voluntarily become moral.
Yes. And so I say again and again, my little motto, my mantra is education, not legislation. Education, not legislation. Education, not legislation. Our job is not to legislate America to be righteous. Our job is to say we live in a free country. Freedom means I don't get to impose my Judeo-Christian view on you. I don't get to do that. If I can convince you, if I can convict you, if I can cause questions in your mind that make your paradigm start to fritz a little at the edges so the Holy Spirit has a way in, the Holy Spirit can convict you. And my job as a Christian is to open some cracks in your paradigm. But how dare I think that's my job if my own paradigm is a titanium sphere that is impregnable to evidence? Even your own biblical interpretations had better be open to contravening evidence. You have a view. We're Sabbath keepers. Most of Christianity isn't. How dare we be intolerant, dogmatic, spiritually superior because we have the right interpretation? You take any biblical interpretation that you have that's part and parcel of your paradigm, you had better be able to pick at it or figure out what might falsify it, because if you're unfalsifiable in principle, the Holy Spirit has no means to lead you into further truth.
Conversely, looking at it from a practical and sociological viewpoint, they have no right to impose on me that I must send my child to a public school
Absolutely.
that teaches that God does not exist.
Absolutely. But the reason we have not the force we should have in making that case is twofold. One, we've spent way too much time being intolerant, legislative, cram it down their throat Christians, and so we've undermined our witness in the world. And conversely, we've turned around and been intellectually dishonest to the point that it's flagrant. And so we've lost intellectual credibility. The reason our kids are leaving us in droves is not because the Holy Spirit has no power in their lives. It's because we have put them in an environment and foisted off on them a paradigm that they themselves are saying, I've got no reason to believe that. And it costs me to believe it. And why should I pay the price for that when I have a good reason to think it's true? So yeah, we've got a lot of sociological work to do in the world, and a lot of it's going to be undoing damage we've been doing over the last 100 years. So part of why I feel so privileged and honored to be doing this series in this very organization, the Church of God Seventh-day, is that we as an organization, I think with our non-creedal, at least formally, we talk like we're a tolerant, open, my mind's not so open that my brains fall out, but neither am I dogmatic in my view about biblical interpretation and so on and so forth. man, I'm telling you, the Church of God Seventh Day, if it would get solidly on the right track, intellectually speaking, could be a force in the world regarding the very things that we're talking about. But one of the things we would have to do first is to get off the mainstream Christian hobby horse about trying to turn the gospel into something that has legal implications. It is not our place to impose our sectarian interpretation of right and wrong out on the world. It's just not our role. And we literally gut our true role by putting our time, energy, and credibility into that. My 2 cents. One final thing, Tom? Okay. Thank you folks so much for your time and attention. We went off on a rant. But anyway, hopefully we've got enough background in place to this point to establish enough credibility that I'm entitled to a good rant every now and then. And thank you guys for your participation.
Let's go ahead and stand and we'll close in a song, and then following